All right, hello everyone. I'm filming this from my room where I do my recording usually, but in the interest of getting this out quickly and making sure that you guys don't have to take an hour to watch it, I'm just going to run through everything that I have from exam 3 that you haven't gotten already from me in this little video, and if I have my stuff together, I'll get it sent out on Tuesday night so you'll have some time to process it before your exam tomorrow. But as always, before I get started, um, if you have any questions about this, if anything's unclear, please do feel free to text or not. You don't even have my number, but you can email me. And if there's anything it's here unclear about this or even earlier material, let me know. I am so happy to answer your questions. But I'm going to make this fast so that we can all get back to our own lives. The first thing, when we left off, we talked about trait theories, and we are trying to get at some kind of explanation of personality. So, what makes people unique? What makes people people? Um, Humanism is this additional idea about personality that doesn't really define it necessarily, but it sets some broad expectations for how people tend to act. So, our first term, um, humanism and existentialism tend to go together. Existentialism tends to spring from what we consider a fear of death. And I know it sounds kind of like, whoa, that's on edge. But you'll see that, especially when we talk about existentialist stuff after humanism, there's this idea that humans are unique in the fact that we are aware of our own imminent demise. That sounds kind of dark, but an elephant might not be, a zebra might not be. So we're trying to think of ways in which we people are significantly different from other animals. That's one of the areas that these humanists and existentialists came up, both as a way of treating humans differently from animals. So when you think of behaviorism, right, pigeons and humans both have superstitious behavior. None of that. And with existentialism, we could talk about this existential dread as a major driving force of personality. The central assumption of humanism is that you can't reduce the mind to analyzable compartments or elements that you can study. So again, it's quite contrary to something like a behaviorist model or even a social cognitive model where it might be like, here's the affective part of your mind, here's the behavioral, and here's the cognitive. You're processing all this, taking in from your environment and making something happen. That doesn't really happen, is the argument of humanism. So humans are some kind of unique whole that you can't reduce to its parts. Um, a name to know with humanism is this Carl Rogers. So Carl Rogers, CARL, is probably the driving psychologist here. Central idea is that people are inherently good. So people are inherently good, but that they are jaded and worn down and made worse over time by these conditions of worth poised by a broader society. You need to make this much money to be valuable. You need to be this tall to be valuable. You need to be this skin color to be valuable. There's all different kinds of things that Carl Rogers talked about, saying something from the external human society that makes somebody worth less or worth more. Um, his focus is trying to understand how these conditions of worth impact individual humans in their phenomenological responses, and that means like the subjective experience of their mind, right? So he's trying to figure out how people function on that level and how these social conditions of worth impede that. Um, Henri says, and I have my notes, that these conditions of worth are for many people actually run counter to the idea of unconditional love, right? Condition of worth, unconditional love. And there's this idea, though, that in order to get respected by society, you have to meet this condition. And I suppose it's an open question of philosophy whether people can actually do that, but most people who have studied it have made up their minds in one way or another. Um, so for Carl Rogers, this comparison drive, this always saying, "How do I work around other people?" is a fundamental aspect of mental health issues and just poor behavior in general. If you look at, there's actually quite a bit of evidence that humans are imitative. You ever heard of the phrase "keeping up with the Joneses"? Right, in 50s, 60s suburbia, I bought a new car because my neighbors did, and I consider my condition relative to the people I'm around. It's also might be a reason why you've heard money doesn't make you happy. Well, people who are rich tend to be around people who are rich. People who are poor tend to be around people who are poor. And when you're around people who have less money, it's easier to count the blessings you do have, goes the argument. And when you're around people that don't, then you have a harder time finding value in the little things. That's not something on your test. I just think it's an interesting example of being imitative. Um, so this comparison drive distorts this inner good, true self. And when you have whenever you're perceiving how other people want you to act or how other people do act, and you see that that's a difference, so you can call it your ideal self, how you want to be perceived, how you want to act. The more different that ideal self is from the true self, the more you feel like you have to work to meet those social conditions of worth, then the larger the distortion in your self is going to become. Abraham Maslow is another name to know when it comes to these humanist psychologists. You probably know Maslow from his hierarchy of needs, which I'm not sure if you actually cover at this point in your class, but I'll leave that there. It might be in my notes later. But both he and Carl Rogers think the primary human motivation, beyond all these surface level social conditions of worth, right? The inner good, the true self, strives towards what's known as self actualization. Self actualization. That is a word that you'll need to just know. But the idea is that you're attaining your full potential, that you have some kind of meter stick, some kind of measurement of your potential inside of you, and that you want to meet that regardless of what other people think about how good that potential would be. So the artist whose art isn't appreciated is working towards his or her full potential, perhaps in spite of the conditions of worth that are there. Existentialism, to make a minor shift, I mentioned that existentialists focus a lot on this idea of existential dread. And to give you a formal definition of that, if you don't have one already, it's the idea that not only your existence is finite, you will pass. Um, It's especially pronounced if you don't believe in some kind of afterlife. That would make the death thing a whole lot easier. But also just the idea of not having a clear purpose in life. This isn't just like people who are depressed. The idea is that these existentialist psychologists are coming from a position where there isn't some kind of underlying or religious rationality in the world. So they espouse what Andre calls this thrownness. He's translating something from German. I don't know the word. You're thrown into the world seemingly without cause, and you're just trying to swim to keep your head above water, but you know that there's there's got to be some kind of deeper value in that, right? But I can't see it. So that's the idea of dread. It's not only that your existence is finite, though that plays a role, but it's also that your existence doesn't seem terribly important or meaningful, right? The universe will last trillions upon trillions of years after you go. It had for 13.5 billion before you came. What's the point? That's the idea. Again, it doesn't mesh well if you have a religious framework because it's coming from a fundamentally different philosophy, but that's the idea. So existentialists focus on this dynamic side of human nature that's constantly changing in response to this existential dread. So culture, beliefs, and of course religions arise from this idea that we need to make some sense out of this thrownness. We need to find something to make sense of our lives, make it seem like we're important in the universe, make it seem like we're important. And excuse me, um, just being in an area of like-minded individuals is one way in which these cultures help to stave off that dread by saying, okay, well, there are people who think like me. We're helping each other through this friendship and socialization. That's got to be good, right? Even if there's nothing else, it's good for something. But in a very Marxian way, almost, there's also the effect with religions specifically of an afterlife, and how that would make you more likely to be okay with the fact that your earthly existence is going to end. The desire to find meaning in general, existentialists will say, well, we try to find meaning in everything. You know, we find that shooting stars grant wishes when it turns out it's just comet debris burning through our atmosphere, right? That's like, again, that's the situation they're coming from. It's a profoundly pessimistic one. But in order to understand it, this voracious desire for meaning comes about from this angst. And angst is another one of those terms that I guess you could define. I don't think it's terribly important, but basically, it's this drive, it's this discomfort without finding meaning. And again, dread and angst are both kind of the same thing. I don't like the way that it's taught. You may have noticed I tend to feel that way, but the there's this essential idea that we need to assign some value to our, in their view, valueless existence, because otherwise we're screwed. What are we going to do? Bad faith is another existentialist term, and this one actually has some relevance in the modern day, but it's the innate human tendency to give up chances for freedom out of fear of having to deal with the subsequent responsibility. The idea that I don't want to be somebody who can make a difference because it's really hard to make a difference. That's terrifying, right? So they call this bad faith. And bad faith becomes a therapeutic tool with these existentialist psychologists that you can use to say, you're clearly just scared of what making a change will do for you. So if you can realize that, if we can make that explicit, and then say, we're going to hype you up until you can do this, you can see that there's some therapeutic value in that. So, okay, more existentialist terms. Um, they believe in a very similar to humanist way. It's kind of why we group them. That each human being has an individual subjective experience. So to use the emotion analogy, is my perception of sadness the exact same as your perception of sadness? I will never know. I can't get inside your mind. It's what philosophers call the problem of other minds. But the idea is that everyone has a unique experience, so it's silly to say that everyone is going to follow this law of psychology, right? Is that everyone's going to respond to a conditioning behaviorist experiment in the same way. It's absurd, is basically what they're saying. Existentialists, and you'll see some parallels with humanists here, they find that suffering comes when you don't have something and you covet it. It's actually very Buddhist in this way. This kind of like faux spirituality where the desire for everything is the root of all evil. It's very Buddhist. Um, they they believe that if we could just say we want meaning, but we just accept that we don't have it, that will make the suffering easier. We want money, but we don't grab at it because it will never make us satisfied. That will make life easier. That's where these existentialists are coming from a therapeutic and from a theoretical perspective. Um, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but existentialists consider the self subjective, which means it can't be ruled by an objective law. Everyone has a unique experience. What does my self's experience of embarrassment is probably similar to yours. I mean, we both blush, but is it the same? I can't say. You can't say. Some interesting experiments in this regard are test subjects who were made aware of their existential dread explicitly in a psych lab. So they'll get like a piece of paper in front of them says, "Thank you for coming to our experiment. Welcome. Hi, hello. You're going to die and the universe won't care." And what we're testing is how tightly do people hold on to their moral values. And the experimental argument that's been made from the evidence is that people hold a lot more tightly when they're scared of death. Interestingly, people appear to be becoming more religious with this fear around the coronavirus pandemic. Is that some kind of latent religious value that's being activated by fear? Who knows? But it's an example of something that you see in your class. When test subjects are primed to consider death, they deliver more or less pain to others. This is an interesting one. If you've ever heard of Stanley Milgram's electric shock experiment, I think you cover it later in this class. Basically, the idea is an authority figure is telling you to give a shock, and every time an actor, what a researcher would call a confederate, so somebody whom the subject does not know is working with you, but who is working with the researcher. intentionally gets questions wrong, and the person in authority with the gray lab coat, right, says, deliver the shock, and it keeps getting worse and worse and worse. People kept going much longer than they expected. That's not actually in your class, but what is in your class is that people who are primed to consider death have a Stanley Milgram-like tendency to deliver a lot more pain than you'd expect. Car crash survivors report an anecdotal urge to spin out and cause as much chaos as possible before they go. There's it seems interesting. Maybe we're unmoored by this desire to appear more beneficent to other people because we're just going to die, and who cares? Um, Whatever your theory is, that's actually an experimental result that's been replicated, which is kind of rare in psychology. So, interesting. Final term here is terror management theory, and this is the idea that when you put in blind faith in your worldview, maybe not necessarily blind, maybe you have some decent justifications for it, but you're getting more comfort out of it than your justifications allow to these terror management theorists. So, faith in one's worldview and the pursuit of self esteem, trying to make yourself feel good in whatever way you can, is a way to stave off this fear of death for a little while. So, if we can impose from the outside some kind of rationality in this world, maybe it'll be easier to live every day, is their argument. If we can make sense of the senseless, if we can make do with what's here, then these terror management theorists will argue that you'll have a much better time coping with this inner existential dread. Nobody's comfortable with the idea of death, but if you feel like you understand how the world works, it'll make it a lot easier, is the idea. So threats to our lives and to our self-esteem cause us to lash out because it's activating that same emotional limbic system circuitry that cares about death, and that's not great. Okay, that is all your stuff for exam 3. I wish you all the best with everything, and I know that a lot of you have Orgo too coming right after. I am also an Orgo tutor, so if you're desperate for anything there, you're free to send me an email. But on that note, I'm going to sign off. I hope everything's going well for you. And again, JODONNE6. Feel free to send me any emails that you need. All right, see ya.